Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think this House is at its best when we get serious issues of this kind and all sides of the House are in agreement, broad agreement, with what needs to be done. We've heard some excellent speeches this afternoon, informed speeches this afternoon from both sides, and I think the announcements made at the beginning of this debate by the Deputy Foreign Secretary are very welcome, particularly the £3 billion this country is going to give Ukraine this year and every year thereafter, and some of the significant sums on, for example, artillery and drones are very welcome. Madam Deputy Speaker, we've reached a critical point in the Ukraine-Russia war when we, along with our allies, need to decide how far and how long we can take our support. In recent weeks, Russian forces have made slow but important advances on Kharkiv area, Ukraine's second largest city, compounding their advances by stretching the Ukraine army along a wide front, opening up new fronts, as well as widening those in Southeast Asia in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, will stretch Ukrainian forces in a battle of resources as Ukraine awaits the delayed US aid and equipment. The UK and the US have provided strong support for Ukraine, but there have been limitation and critical delays, as others have said, in providing the weapons and equipment needed. We are at a point where this war is dragging on, with limited and slow advances on both sides. The West has provided enough support for Ukrainians to defend themselves, but not enough to make decisive advances, let alone enough to end the war. We must decide with our allies if we step up this support now to persuade the Russians to withdraw from Ukraine. What we should not do is allow a war in Europe to drag on many years and become a frozen conflict. This will cause an increased death toll, damage to Ukraine infrastructure, and an impact on our own and other Western economies. Not only will this continue to prolong the suffering of the long and brave Ukrainian people, it will make the job of rebuilding the country in the longer term much more difficult. There is a strong possibility that if we are not sufficiently determined to oppose Russia now, their aggression will not cease with Ukraine. We've only got to look at what's happening in Georgia at the moment. Whatever the rights and wrongs of that particular demonstrations are over the foreign agents law, it is clear that the majority of people in Georgia want a closer alignment with Europe and NATO over their historic ties with Russia. And this will be a cause for thought in Moscow. I use those words carefully. In Europe, the possibility of a Baltic state or Moldova also being at risk. What would it mean if a NATO state was targeted next? Estonia's Prime Minister has urged at the security conference held in Tallinn for NATO allies to follow their response in stepping up support for Ukraine. While in Moldova, they have recently defied Russia with an EU security pact, deepening defence cooperation. And of course, one of the outcomes, whatever happens to the war in Ukraine, is that both Norway and Sweden have become members of NATO. Finland and Sweden have become members of NATO. It's deeply held, independent, non-aligned, neutral countries joining NATO must be a real slap in the face for the Russians. European countries have a huge vested interest in continuing to provide considerably more equipment and training. Some countries, as I've already mentioned, such as Germany and Poland, are to be commended for what they've done. As I've already said, the UK is sending an extra $500 million on top of the $2.5 billion in military aid it had already pledged to give Ukraine in 2024. In February, the EU agreed to further $42 billion package, but by March they had failed to meet targets on shells to Ukraine. After the US, Germany, UK is the third largest suppliers of weapons and equipment to Ukraine. And as I indicated in my intervention on the Deputy Foreign Secretary in his excellent speech, I think we must do much more on the diplomatic front to try and encourage a coalition of the willing. Because as my right honourable friend for Harwich and North Essex said, the consequences of the Russians winning in Ukraine are huge, in the longer term, because it does mean, I think, that a number of non-aligned nations will then decide perhaps that they are better with the coalition of Russia and China rather than the West, and that would be an utter disaster. So it is important that we try to build that coalition of the willing, and it isn't just Europe and America that I was thinking of. I think there are countries in Southeast Asia, countries in the Middle East, that we should be trying to persuade to join in this coalition. And whilst, of course, the US have been a huge suppliers of arms and financial support, their contributions to the war have far outweighed what has been sent by all other countries put together. In a recent visit to Kiev, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, pledged ongoing US support for Ukraine after Congress had approved its $61 billion aid package. Arriving at the front line, as my right honourable friend from Bradley, Stoke and Filton has said, are the ATA-CMS long-range precision-guided missiles. Of the £61 billion worth of aid being provided, around $8 billion will be used to resupply with Ukraine with missiles and ammunition. A critical point. These missiles are absolutely critical. The US has also been stepping up its own arms manufacturing, as we heard on the PAC visit to the Pentagon 2 months ago. And that is absolutely critical. And I believe Europe needs to step up its arms manufacturing, which it's pledged to do, but it seems to be doing far too slowly. And it isn't, just as my honourable friend said, just the manufacturing. These shells require huge volumes of hardened shelters to put them in. So there's a lot attached to building up this capacity, but he was quite right to indicate the figures that he gave, and I think furthermore, after that first year, the second year, the step up will be even greater. So that is really good news. But as the Prime Minister said, we are facing some of the most dangerous and yet transformational years to come. Others have mentioned that the Ukrainians must be free to make the decisions on how they use the arms that we supplied. They should not be hampered by conditions imposed by us. It is an utter nonsense to watch the Russian troops massing on the border near Kharkiv and then expecting them not to use the vital weapons that we've supplied to prevent that happening. An important area that's not been discussed this afternoon, I think, is that any military tactician knows that to win a ground war needs air superiority. And therefore, if the West really wants to help Ukraine, it's got to be far more generous in providing fighter aircraft, complete with trained Ukrainian pilots and anti-aircraft missiles. The Ukraine has constantly asked the US for fighter jets to counter Russia's air superiority. In May 23, the US agreed to let other nations supply Ukraine with US-made F-16s. But the US has hundreds of these aircrafts, which are being rapidly superseded, and could well afford to donate some of them. Instead, it said that the F-16s must be supplied by Denmark, Netherlands, and other nations, and we must train those pilots in how to use them. As others have said, our missiles have been very effective at deterring Russian ships in the Black Sea. Now, I say to the SNP spokesman, who slightly, and I'm not really criticising, but he slightly dismissed the fact that grain was getting out of Ukraine. Not only is that good in itself, but what is really important, and others have touched on this, is that small businesses are actually able to flourish in Ukraine today, and it's really important that they are able to generate profits, and even more important, able to employ people who are not able to fight in the war, such as women who are not on the front. So this is really important that the Ukrainian economy is beginning to actually flourish again. I'd happily give way to him.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I don't disagree with the honourable gentleman at all. What I was very specific what I said. I talked about its tactical advantage, and that is minimal.
I entirely accept what the honourable gentleman has said. As Russian advances are being made in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin was making a state visit to China in a show of strength. China is the largest investor in Ukraine after Russia, and it is propping up the Russian economy, the ailing Russian economy, by buying a significant quantity of Russian oil and gas at cheap prices. And China could have a significant influence on Russia, settle the war if it chose to do so. I have to say that a group of colleagues visited China the other day and made these points, but I don't think we had any impact on the Chinese. Surprise, surprise, maybe some of you would say. But you have to go and you have to engage, otherwise you certainly won't have an impact. Putin has been making recent changes, dismissing his defence minister who had been in charge since 2022, the beginning of the war, when Putin expected Russia to take Kiev in days, replacing him with a very different person in Andrei Buloshkov, who is now overseeing the $117 billion defence spending that Russia has embarked on, building up a Russian war machine, reminiscent to what they did in World War II, turning their entire economy onto a war footing, suggesting that Putin is preparing for a long war with Europe. In addition, its allies, China, Iran, North Korea, have huge manufacturing capabilities who could replace a significant proportion of Russian arsenal if they wished. If it is the case that we and our allies are unwilling to provide more decisive support, there will inevitably be a political settlement between the two countries, which will leave Russia in a far more powerful position, as I indicated earlier. Of course, as my honourable friend Farage indicated, we don't know what the US position will be after the elections in November. And that is why I would say to my honourable friend on the front bench today, it is imperative that we engage with both sides in that election, both Republican and Democrats, so that whatever happens, we are making the point strongly that it is vital that the Americans continue on this course. Otherwise, there is a danger that we will not be able to win this war. Hotbeds of tension could unravel in the years to come in the Middle East and East Asia, around Taiwan and China, are being carefully managed at the moment. Eyes are on the West and how we deal with Russia. The more Russia succeeds in Ukraine, the more cooperation between Russia and China seems to be strengthening, and the old enmity between them is reducing. This is incredibly dangerous, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Urgent, concerted and positive help must be given to Ukrainian people in their hour of need for as long as it is needed to deter Russia from taking any further offensive action in the rest of Europe.
Maria Rimmer.